Hi, welcome to Different Class again. Our next event is on the topic of climate change as part of our series on states of emergency. The text we'll be using is by Andreas Malm, Corona Climate Economic Emergency. We'll send links to that and more details about the event elsewhere. We'll just have a chat about the text today. This is a text, I think, although our topic this month is climate change. This is a text that sees climate change and our current emergency crisis around the pandemic as inextricably linked. And to that extent, it also makes a case for a positive case for a state of emergency. Am I right in saying that, Jonathan? Do you think?
Yes, I think that's exactly right. I think one of the ways in which this text is rather different, perhaps, from some of the other texts that we've considered in this reading group, is that exactly this is a text which endorses emergency rule. It is a call for exceptional measures rather than a meditation on the dangers that tend to accompany exceptional measures in the name of emergency. So for Andreas Malm, the author of the book, the present situation is one in which we face climate change, global heating on the one hand, and also a series of other inextricably linked phenomena, such as the pandemic of the last year, and that altogether these require some type of immediate action on the part of political authorities. So exceptional measures by the state, not least in the area of property rights, in areas in which what Malm refers to as fossil capital can be interrupted, and the economic model of contemporary society is remade in a way that interrupts these crises as we experience them today. So this is not an argument for anything goes, if you like. It's not that Malm wants to say in kind of authoritarian manner that we can do anything to respond to the crises of the present. There's plenty of reflection on questions of democracy and how to reconcile these with the need for strong executive action. But I think, unlike other texts that we have been looking at in our series, here the emphasis, the accent is very much on how executive action has to be vigorous, urgent, and transgressive where it needs to be.
I suppose in our previous texts, we've certainly often discussed the notion that emergencies should be in some way bounded, in some way like clearly defined, and have an idea of an endpoint. Malm, I think, takes a different approach to this. Would you see it that way?
Yeah, again, somewhat different from other texts that we've been looking at. This is someone who wants to embrace an idea of exceptional rule, but mindful of the risks that come with designating a certain set of problems as emergencies. I think a theme that we've had in past sessions of our reading group is that when you talk about emergencies, you often somehow isolate particular problems in time and space. You treat the emphasis on what emerges very suddenly, on urgent, pressing challenges, and perhaps downplay the context, the underlying causes that perhaps are much more long-lasting, that are not suddenly appearing. And Malm is, of course, highly mindful of this point. He wants to talk about emergency, and with all the sense of urgency and the call to arms that suggests, but at the same time, for him, it's very important that one doesn't lose sight of causalities and end up focusing only on the symptoms, only, if you like, on the pandemics or the wildfires, the kind of things that maybe are symptomatic of capitalism and its effects on nature, rather than the things which drive that. In other words, long-lasting capitalist trends that are playing out over decades and indeed longer. So exactly as you say, Nathan, this is someone who wants to emphasize that the rhetoric and the practices of urgency associated with emergency are very important, but we mustn't fall into the trap of isolating a certain set of problems as merely temporary, as demanding a merely temporary response, and overlooking where they come from. I think that's absolutely right. That's a second respect in which I think this is a book that's distinctive from other things that we've looked at and distinctive within the larger realm of emergency thinking. Maybe I'd add also one further point to this, which is that much that we have examined in previous sessions about emergency rule has this emphasis on restoration. This goes back, of course, right to our first discussion of Machiavelli, and indeed Machiavelli talking about ancient Rome. The the license for emergency measures has often felt to lie in the idea that they restore some type of preceding order before the emergency. They're not meant to transform things. Maybe they're not meant to touch the constitution of a polity. They're simply meant to enable the conditions for the restoration of stability. And again, I think this is rather different in Andreas Malm's piece. This is not emergency understood as restoring things as they once were, because of course then that again might be to overlook the long-standing drivers of crises that mean that there was really no preceding normality to which one might want to move back. Rather, for Malm, this is a story of necessary transformation, of transition to a fundamentally new order. It's about shutting down fossil capital and everything that comes from that, and exactly transitioning to a rather different socio-economic model. So this is emergency not justified in terms of ultimately it doesn't change very much. It simply restores things as they once were. On the contrary, this has to be emergency measures understood as transformative and exactly licensed by the appeal of the new socio-economic model that they would usher in.
In rejecting the notion that we can restore a previous order, does that make this pessimistic text, or is the possibility of introducing something new, does it make it optimistic? Can we catch it out in those terms?
Yeah, we can probably read it actually in both of those terms. I mean, I think on one hand, clearly much that's been written about climate change and a climate emergency can shade into a sort of kind of fatalism. And Malm is clearly someone hyper aware of that danger and keen to act against it. So in some sense, this is a text that wants to emphasize not just the coming catastrophe, but the scope for agency in averting or redirecting those tendencies. And here, of course, he wants to draw on some of the events of the last year around the COVID-19 pandemic and find something instructive about them. And of course, much of the earlier parts of the book involve reading the story of 2020 as something instructive about when governments are willing to take action and when they're not, almost affirmative of the possibility that we can act if we want to. In other words, capitalism can be paused. We saw that, I think, in the spring of 2020, and capitalist interests can be sidestepped, at least under certain conditions. So there is a kind of a message of optimism that comes out of 2020 because it shows that we can act. If we want to, it's possible to do something. And of course, for Malm, this is then coupled with historical analogy. In other words, important parts of this book are not just about the last year, but about going back into the 20th century and finding historical analogies that again show us that when political actors want to take measures and to take control of a situation, they're able to do so. This is why Malm talks quite a lot about what he calls ecological Leninism. In other words, finding a historical analogy in the Soviet response to war in the early 20th century, and the capacity to reshape society in the context of war-induced emergency. So there are, for Malm, and clearly something we'll want to talk about, historical analogies that say action in the face of emergency can be done where there is, if you like, a will, but also strategies of destabilizing capitalist power that would obstruct this. So to that degree, it is, I think, maybe optimistic is perhaps the wrong way to phrase it, but a affirmative story. Perhaps the caveat, though, would be that the danger, on the other hand, will be waiting for, if you like, a revolutionary moment. If one wanted to pursue that historical analogy, waiting for a revolutionary moment in which capitalism itself can be overthrown, and treating this as the precondition for taking serious action on climate change. In other words, if one accepts that our present problems are ultimately not to do with something more general like modernity or kind of modern ways of living, but they are tightly rooted in capitalism, then you might logically conclude that if capitalism is the problem, then the overthrow of capitalism is the way forward. I think Malm wants to be cautious on that front, because exactly because the urgency of the situation perhaps doesn't leave time for waiting or even trying to bring about the overthrow of capitalism. This type of strategy can easily be, while ostensibly highly radical, can have rather unradical effects insofar as it scales up the response to the problem to a level that is hard to act upon, and perhaps simply leaves the emergency to go unaddressed. And so in some sense, this is an even more challenging situation that Malm is describing, where we have to act against capitalist interests, and yet we cannot afford to wait for the overthrow of capitalism. We have to work with the kind of states, with the kind of economic systems that we have, and try to change them from within, rather than simply wait for their supersession. So this, I think, is another very interesting aspect of the book. It's a diagnosis which is far-reaching, based on the very fundaments of contemporary socioeconomic models, and yet a prescription that nonetheless says that we don't have time to wait to overthrow that system. It's almost more radical than the revolutionary strategy, and I think that's a very interesting thought to keep in mind.
Thank you for that. The text again is Corona Climate Chronic Emergency by Andreas Malm, which we'll be using to discuss climate change at our next different class. Hope to see you there.
See you then.